Over the last month, I made a first-person shooter that you control with your voice. And before we get into the video, you can go play the game right now. There's a link at the top of the description, and it's free. So making a game with microphone input isn't unique, but I felt like my idea was. I want to make a game where you control a gun by moving it left or right, and then you shoot at targets that are constantly moving towards you. If you don't shoot them, you lose. It's a simple concept, but it'll be made harder by the fact that your only input is your voice. But I had to solve a few problems first. Before I started, there were a few things I wanted to avoid. I wanted the microphone to control every input for gameplay, meaning that I couldn't have the microphone only control shooting while you still aim with a mouse or controller. But I wanted to have at least 3 inputs because I felt like that was the minimum for making the game interesting to play. But getting 3 inputs from the microphone wasn't easy, and I initially had 2 ideas. First was voice recognition, but I felt like that was really lame. To me, there's nothing more boring in a game than just speaking the controls to the screen. So my other idea was to map frequencies to inputs. And I should preface this with, outside of having ears, I know nothing about audio, but from editing, I know that you have equalizers which give you control over certain frequencies of an audio clip so you can lower or raise them to get rid of things like humming or noise. So I figured if I get a hold of this frequency data from the microphone, I could map 3 different ranges in these frequencies, each to a different input. So if they went over a threshold, that would trigger a unique input. I put a lot of effort into this and I got this working, but there were a lot of problems. I wanted to ensure that since this game centered around microphone use, there needed to be an abundance of adjustments so that anyone could ensure the game would work with their microphone and their setup. But this system was so complicated that adjustments were hard to get right, and part of the reason the adjustments were so hard was because it turned out to be way harder to make high frequency sounds than I assumed it would be. So I was doing a lot of things with biasing higher frequency sounds, and it was all just way too much, and I thought of a way simpler idea. Now the game only cares about how loud you are, so the game's constantly checking your noise level and then doing inputs accordingly. So to explain this in non-audio terms, if you have a range of 0 to 100, and 0 is completely silent, and then 100 is fully loud or clipping, I made a system so that if you go over like 25, that would register as a left movement. Then if you went over 50, that would register as a right movement. And then if you went over something like 75, that would be a shooting input. This system worked a lot better, it was easier to understand, it wasn't infuriating to use, and it's really simple to adjust. This was the easy part. I started by modeling a gun and a target in Blender, and then I threw them into Unity. I set the gun to be controlled with movement from the keyboard initially so I didn't have to constantly scream at my computer when debugging things, and then I got a target spawning system working. This target spawner has a list of spawn points that are about 300 units back behind the player, and it'll spawn on one of them based on the timer, and once these targets are spawned, they just constantly move forward until they hit a trigger that's at the player, and this trigger will either deactivate them or end the game depending on if the target has been shot or not. Which shooting was super simple to add. The player just does a raycast out of the barrel of the gun to see if it hits anything, and if it finds a collider of a target, it'll tell the target to play its flip up animation, and give the player some points. I also added a laser effect to the gun so you knew where the gun was aiming, as well as a muzzle flash effect that I found for free on the asset store. For recoil, I was having some trouble with Unity's animation system getting it to work around some of the rotations that I was using to move the gun, so I ended up making a coroutine that just moved the rotation and position of the gun back like the animation would have, and this ended up working a lot better because it gave me a lot more flexibility with the rotations that I used on the gun. UI is the most tedious part of game development for me, but I knew it would be really important for this game because of visualizers for the audio. With this microphone input system, it's really important to have a visualizer so you can see how your voice is currently impacting the input and what you need to get the input you want. When I was using the frequency method, this was all super hard to set up because I had multiple line renderers and their own rendering layer, and they were on their own cameras, and it was just horrible. But with this new system, it's a lot simpler because I can just have an image that scales vertically with your voice input to show you your audio level. But like I mentioned when talking about input, adjustments were really important in this concept, and that was all going to happen inside the UI. So to handle that, I made a pause screen and added that same audio visualizer that I did on the gameplay screen, and put 3 sliders on there that were the same height as the visualizer, and turned off all the visuals except for the knobs. I gave each of these a threshold bar image that went across the visualizer, and you could move them up and down, but I made them so they can't pass each other. This all worked really well and was really intuitive for adjusting the thresholds for each input. After that, there's still a lot of UI that needed to be made, but I didn't have a good idea for how it should all look. So before focusing on that, I just got everything in there and working with its default style, got it all functional, and then I went through and I updated fonts and backgrounds and made it all look cohesive. Now the game fully worked and it had UI, but nothing really looked too great. So I revamped the gameplay environment to make it look like a shooting range with some free materials I found in the asset store, along with a new gun model that was made by someone who actually knows what they're doing. I also added some post-processing, which greatly improved the look of the game. Then I added a global leaderboard with PlayFab, which was super easy to do because I've done things like that in previous videos for other games, and I just took that same script I've used before and I threw it in there, and I had global leaderboards in about 30 minutes. I tried to make a menu screen that looked interesting. I did this with an animation that plays in the background. This is done with a gun that's like the one in the actual game that moves kind of sporadically like you would if you were controlling it with your voice. And then in certain parts of the animation, it will shoot, and that fires the animation event. That handles things like audio, which is just me screaming, ah, 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 and then other things like the targets flipping up and all of that. This animation just loops indefinitely, and I personally think it's pretty funny. I also made a logo for the game, but I couldn't figure out a way to make a title on the menu that looked good. But then I had an idea for using the same microphone input that I have in the game and using that to scale part of the title up and down. And that looked pretty good. So with all that, the game is done. So I guess I should show it to you now. Okay, I'm not going to show you everything, but here's a clip of me getting my high score. Oh my. This is my favorite game that I've ever made. It's such a stupid concept, but I think it's genuinely hilarious to play in front of people. I recommend putting it on your laptop and pulling it out in a group of friends, and I guarantee that you'll have a good time. But all that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more stuff like it, please consider subscribing. I have a lot of videos planned that I'm really excited for. And if you want to join my Discord, or follow me on Twitter, or just play any of the games I've made in the past, there's links to all that down in the description below. Bye.